Welcome back to another episode of Dysphagia Matters. Today we're speaking with someone who approaches dysphagia from a completely different angle than most of our guests. Professor Ervin Sejdić is not a clinician, but he's an engineer.
And that matters, because the question he's trying to answer is essentially, can we build something that tells us what FEES and videofluoroscopy tell us, but without the equipment, the dysphagia specialist and the clinic?
His lab works on computational biomarkers for dysphagia, with sensors, signal processing, and machine learning. The idea being that a swallow leaves a kind of acoustic and vibrational fingerprint, and that fingerprint carries clinical information that can inform the following dysphagia management.
Enjoy listening.
Welcome, Ervin, and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on today's episode.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're an engineer by training, yet much of your work is deeply embedded in swallowing science. How did you first get drawn into the world of dysphagia research?
So it was an interesting path to all of this. By the end of my PhD, I was actually supposed to work for a crown corporation here in Canada, which is crown corporations meaning like government organizations. And I was supposed to work on developing novel types of sensors for nuclear reactors. And
okay. Very different.
Very, very different. So just to kind of give you a quick background, my undergrad degree is in electrical engineering. I specialized in wireless communications. And then for my PhD, I did, mostly focus on signal processing. I like data science. And by the end of my PhD, I had a wonderful opportunity to work for a crown corporation here in Canada. It's just when I realized where the research lab is, I realized that I cannot go there because it's like somewhere north of Ottawa, a few hours north of Ottawa, for reasons like it's a nuclear research facility, so it had to be away from big cities, right? And I just did not feel like it's going into middle of Ontario to work on nuclear reactors. So I started looking around and I accidentally came across an opportunity with Professor Tom Chow at the University of Toronto, who was looking for a postdoc. And he mentioned something in his ad, dysphagia and stuff like that. And this is like, I had no idea what's dysphagia. So I said, sure, whatever. And we had chatted briefly and Tom offered me the position right away of a postdoc, and I joined his lab initially just for a year. Later on, I stayed for 3 years just because I enjoyed it very much. But I was initially hired to work on this from a data science point of view, just to kind of Professor Chow and Professor Katrina Steele from U of T as well. They started kind of collecting this huge data set of swallowing vibrations in a Ontario Science Center, which is kind of a science center / museum here in Toronto. And they needed somebody to analyze the data. And I said, sure, I can do it. And Tom was kind of what we initially thought that's going to take me about 6 months to analyze. I was even more confident. I told him I'm going to be done in 3 months. And this was in February of 2018. So I'm still working on those problems. So both of us kind of underscored the difficulty of the problem. But it was a very... at that time I was fresh out of grad school, an engineer, and it's like, yeah, sure, I'll work on this and, a few other projects. However, over the years, I kept getting grants and I kept getting recognized for my work on dysphagia. And I was lucky, very lucky to partner up with Professor Jim Coyle from the University of Pittsburgh once I moved to Pittsburgh. And I'm not sure whether you guys remember the name or not, but Jim Coyle was one of those guys that developed penetration aspiration scale.
Mm-hmm.
So he was one of the authors of the study. And working with Jim and his team was just an eye-opening experience. Again, Jim is a very upbeat person. So initially, when I said, well, we should collaborate, hear me out. And he said, sure, sounds good. I'll help this new professor. He sounds eager enough, so I'll help him out. But then after a few years, like Jim really recognized the value of what we were doing, because essentially we were trying to adopt AI, machine learning techniques to swallowing world starting in 2011. So many years before AI was really popular. And it worked out for us. And as I collaborated with Jim, I learned a lot. I still don't claim that I know too much about dysphagia, but I know enough so I can actually talk. But it was interesting. It was unusual topic for me, completely different. I still remember my first few meetings with Katrina Steele and her team, and they would keep mentioning hyoid bone, and I had no idea what the hell is hyoid bone. So I kept, back then, I think iPhones just came out, so I had iPhone 3, and I kept Googling while we were in the meeting just because I was like, there's a bone in your neck and it's moving things. Wow, right? So it was a big, revelation for me back then. But over the years, I've learned many things, and it's nice. It was interesting, unusual, and definitely a path that not many engineers take. Even right now, I think I'm one of the few technical people in the field. Unfortunately, I would love to have a lot more technical people, because I think dysphagia and this entire field really needs more technical people in order to bring us up to the next level, where we can actually start developing medical devices, start developing things, solutions that we can deploy in a clinical space, and not just devices. There are many other things that need to be developed and contributed to the field. So it's very interesting, but highly unusual path.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a very interesting career path towards dysphagia and dysphagia research, for sure. For our audience who may not be as familiar with signal processing, you've mentioned it already. Could you explain what it is and what a computational biomarker is and why it matters for swallowing assessment?
So signal/image processing is what we used to call data science before data science was a popular term. So essentially, it's a study of how we analyze data and how we can deduce information and important details from various data sets, right? So signal processing typically focuses on one-dimensional signals such as speech, right? So when we record speech, it's really just one-dimensional. If we plot it on the screen, it's a bunch of wiggly lines, right? And there is also image processing, which is more dealing with images, right? Nowadays, we mostly refer to it as computer vision. But, these are the early, we use newer names for it, but it's still the same idea. It's basically how we analyze data. And signal processing really focuses on this one-dimensional physiological data that we were looking at. And in our case, we were specifically looking at swallowing vibrations. So we captured vibrations on the neck, and we were trying to deduce information about swallowing mechanism, just basically looking at these vibratory signals and what can we learn, right? And computational biomarkers, it's an idea that I kind of started throwing around. Before joining the University of Pittsburgh, I was a postdoc also at Harvard Medical School in the geriatrics division. And we talked a lot about biomarkers there, right? It's a medical school. And I kept thinking, well, typically we look at molecular biomarkers and like what different biomarkers, whether it's blood-based biomarkers or some other. And I thought, well, we're going to have more and more data over the years. So what we need to do is forget about molecular biomarkers or typical stuff. Let's see what we can capture from data and develop biomarkers based on data. So we kind of coined the term computational biomarkers, right? Can we find a biomarker, assign, something that we can track through disease or health and see how, for example, swallowing mechanism changes with varying conditions. So whether it's a disease or maybe different bolus viscosity or anything else, right? Can we develop these biomarkers so we can actually track health, right? And my specialty is computational science, so I said, why don't we do computational biomarkers, right? And nowadays it's like we have so much data, so really we don't need to always do blood work in order to develop a biomarker. We can really look at data, right? When I started talking about it, and everybody looked at me in a kind of weird way. What is computational biomarker? Why do we want to look at data instead of the actual, blood analysis or something else? And I kind of kept advocating that no, data is going to give us enough information so we can infer about what is going on. So that was the whole idea about computational biomarkers. And then a few years ago, myself, Jim Coyle, and Georgia Malandraki from Purdue back then, we published even the idea of computational deglutition, right? Kind of a position paper in one of the engineering journals where we said, we talk about computational neuroscience, right? Where we are trying to understand various neuroscience aspects just by looking at the computational side of things. Well, why don't we try to understand swallowing as well through means of computation? And I've been pushing, myself and Jim, we've been pushing this idea, well, we can really use computation to understand things rather than just always purely observation.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, purely observing, it's a good term here. So if we consider silent aspiration, it's invisible to us without imaging equipment such as FEES or videofluoroscopy. So we need to observe people for swallowing, and typically we start with the standard screening. But patients can pass the standard screening and still be at risk of aspiration. So what are the limitations of these tools that your research is trying to address?
So what we're really trying, you pointed out silent aspiration. So this is one of those things that we can do with simple gadgets and nice algorithms, right? So silent aspiration is a typical thing that unless we use videofluoroscopy or FEES, we won't know about it, right? And most people silently aspirate. So what we said is, all right, well, let's attach a simple sensor on the neck and see whether we can infer about silent aspirations just by monitoring vibrations of the neck. And what we are trying really with these vibrations, what they represent is if you plug your ears and swallow, the sound that you hear in your head, that's the sound we are trying to capture, right? Or if you palpate your neck during swallowing, that vibrations that you feel under your fingertips, those are the vibrations we are trying to capture as well. And based on those kind of sounds and vibrations, we are trying to infer whether there is a silent aspiration or not. And nowadays we can infer many more things, not just silent aspirations. But in order to get there, I have to be honest, we had to use the gold standard. In our case, it was the videofluoroscopy exam, right? So every algorithm that we developed was from data that was concurrently acquired during videofluoroscopy. So we had the ground truth, and we were able to label all of it according to the ground truth, right? So there's a lot of machine learning, right? But these simple gadgets and these computational approaches actually enable us to detect silent aspirations without using radiation, right? And not just in a clinical setting, like kind of X-ray suite setting. Now we can do that bedside, right? Mm-hmm. Much more accurately than a simple water test that we typically use these days. I'm not sure what's the standard in Germany, but here in North America, they still just give you a glass of water and like, drink.
Yeah, I guess it depends on where you work, but they do that too, I think. So do I understand you correctly that based on your work, that you can now detect silent aspiration through the vibration?
Yes, okay. We can. Silent respiration and a few other things, a few other diagnostic things we can detect.
Like what?
Pretty much we are able to score according to penetration aspiration scale. We're able to even infer about LVC or US movements and opening and closing of those structures, right? So our limitation right now is really, we have a human factor issue. We have one of the largest data sets now. There's concurrent data sets when it comes to videofluoroscopy and swallowing vibration. So a few hundred patients and healthy controls. And we are able to dig through these images and manually label images for various things that are of interest. And we're able to train algorithms so we can actually non-invasively detect. So for example, a few years ago, we published a paper where we tracked hyoid bone excursion during swallows completely non-invasively. So the path that you can observe on videofluoroscopy of a hyoid bone, we can now tell you how that path looks like just by attaching a sensor, right? So we're really solving one by one. As you guys know better than I do, there are many different events that happen during each swallow. And we're basically tracking event by event, labeling the data. And this is where kind of what our bottleneck currently is, just purely labeling these images and trying to, based on these labels, to develop algorithms. Once we have the labels, we are able to develop these algorithms fairly quickly. Our bottleneck is actual labeling. We are still on that. And we're trying now, we have a bunch of image processing, so computer vision algorithms that enable us to feed videofluoroscopy exam video to these algorithms, and they're able to tell us a few things. So most of the time, so far, we looked at hyoid bone excursion and bolus path. What we're trying also to do now is also to develop algorithms that will automatically score videos based on penetration aspiration scale. That's also kind of a tricky problem because, as you know, most of swallows, even in patients, are swallows that are rated 1 or 2 according to the penetration aspiration scale. And we rarely get those 7 and 8s, right, that we really need. So it is a bit of a data science problem as well, in addition to acquiring data, but we're working on it, and we're really going down the list. So Professor Coyle developed a list of different events that are of interest to the community. We're just doing checkbox.
Amazing.
So this method is called high resolution cervical auscultation, right?
So basically we use accelerometers. Accelerometer and a microphone, they are more or less the same sensors. They have slightly different transducers, how they transduce energy, right? And there was something in the field in early 2000s called cervical auscultation, where many clinicians claimed they can use a stethoscope to listen to the sounds. And while there were many different discussions about it, there was an issue with a stethoscope. If you look at the frequency response of a stethoscope, most stethoscopes are designed to capture what? Heart sounds, lung sounds, and inner sounds of the body. The frequency of those sounds are much higher than the frequency of sounds and vibrations that we get on the neck. And most of the time, those stethoscopes would filter out essentially data that we need.
Not very helpful.
Not very helpful, right? So we realized we are really doing cervical auscultation, right? Because we are auscultating with just a different sensor. Instead of a stethoscope, we are auscultating with an accelerometer, right? When we started talking about cervical auscultation, everybody was kind of, no, like, that's a bad word, right? So in order to avoid all of, bad things associated with cervical auscultation, we call it high-resolution cervical auscultation. Our accelerometer really has a flat frequency response all the way down to 0 hertz, more or less. Meaning that it passes all these sounds without attenuating them. All these sounds and vibrations. So we are really able to capture what is going on at the low frequency ranges. And it makes sense. If we were talking about higher frequencies, then it would be a very loud meat every time we eat, right? Most of the things that happen here are really low frequency. We're talking below 100 hertz, right? Because it's just a flow most of the time and few structures moving around. So they do not necessarily produce high frequencies, right? Which kind of brings an interesting point. When I started working on my postdoc with Tom and Katrina, they gave me a first data set, like the first part of the data set, but I think it was about 100 people or so back then. And they asked me to analyze it, to summarize, characteristics of these recordings that we had. And I came back and I analyzed the frequency content of these signals. And I said, no, most of the frequency components are really below 100 hertz. And I remember we had numerous discussions about this because the literature that we looked at that time was really reporting that, these sounds and vibrations, the center frequency, so the most dominant frequency, is really around 9 kilohertz. And that did not make sense to me at all, because at 9 kilohertz, it's in an audible range. So meaning every time we would eat, we would clearly hear each other's swallows. And it would be very kind of loud meal. So we started digging through the literature, especially a few papers that reported those things. So going back to the cervical auscultation idea, right? And what I found out is that these initial papers in 1990s that recorded swallowing sounds, they were using a microphone that was purchased at Radio Shack. So for those of you, I'm not sure whether you guys remember, no, but Radio Shack was like a kind of a chain of these cute electronic stores here in North America that you can buy, things if you wanted to build, various, and they were selling audio and video equipment and so on. And I said, oh, okay, that's unusual that they would purchase something for a scientific experiment in Radio Shack, but hey. And then I started looking at the microphone they used. And the microphone they used was essentially a microphone for karaoke with frequency bandwidth optimized for about 9 kilohertz, because that's, most of the... So that kind of led us to many of these, how do we differentiate? How do we call it? Why do we call it HRCA, right? High resolution instead of... So we were trying to move away from some of the historical lessons that we've learned over the years.
That's very interesting. Also, the entire journey of developing a tool like that and what it takes and where you go and find karaoke microphones and stuff like that and what it has to do with the dysphagia management. What would a tool like that, for example, what do you think do you need to have studied so that it becomes a part of the standard clinical assessment?
What do you mean?
Is it used as a standard clinical tool at the moment?
Not yet.
And what is missing for now that we can use it as therapists?
What we're really missing is commercialization of these tools. Right? So there has to be a company that's going to start selling all of this, right? My group is one of the few groups that is trying, right, to develop these. There are a few other groups here in North America and across the globe who are trying to develop, but we still have not moved from kind of research-based tools into the here's the device, go use it. And it has to then come down to the business side of things. Somebody needs to commercialize and to take these tools out of kind of research sphere into the real clinical sphere, because I think at the end of the day, it's going to be mostly beneficial not for clinicians working in like large medical centers that have, access to everything. Because most SLPs do not work in a large medical centers with gazillion of different clinicians. Most SLPs work in community hospitals, community settings, right? And this is where the really contribution of all of this is going to be quite powerful, because we will enable clinicians even in the smaller institutions to actually have access to some of the top-notch devices, but also the decisions that these devices can make. And again, I'm sure it's the same issue in Germany and other European countries. If you're in a large medical center, then you're good. You have access to everything, but most people don't work in a large medical center. So.
And most patients don't come to the large medical center, but are treated in their homes or outpatient settings. Yeah. So dysphagia affects patients across very different settings, as we know, from pediatrics to neurology, head and neck cancer, and to older people living in nursing homes. Do your tools work equally well across all these groups, or are there populations where the technology is working better than in others?
So the short answer is yes. And it had to do with the design of study that Jim and I started in Pittsburgh. So when we went for the first study, Jim was like, all right, let's do very well-defined, protocol. Let's measure 5 milliliters. Like, let's exclude anybody we were initially just looking at the stroke patients. And I had a wild idea, being an ignorant engineer that I am. I said, how about we kind of, instead of having very nice data set, how about we collect realistic data sets? And it took me a while, to pursue him that it's going to work out at the end, because nobody did it before. But we said, all right, let's get stroke patients and anybody else that comes for videofluoroscopy. So we were pretty much approaching patients that are scheduled to have their videofluoroscopy done. And I said, all right, well, let's do, stroke, because that was our initial grant for stroke patients, but let's kind of collect from anybody else that shows up for video fluoroscopy. And the other thing that I asked Jim is like, do not interfere the study, video fluoroscopy, with our own protocol. Let's just collect data. And whatever we do, like if it's, 3 swallows of thin liquid, fine, then 20 swallows of nectar thick, fine. Like we don't have to have consistent protocol across. I wanted to capture more real life settings. And while initially it gave us so many headaches, because when you start capturing stuff in real life, you don't get nice graphs, but enable us to develop algorithms that are fairly robust. So in our data sets, we have people that are stroke patients, we have a bunch of lung transplant patients, we have people with various neurological disorders. I don't think we have head and neck cancer because of the radiation and structural damages that can occur. So we stayed away from head and neck cancer patients. Especially after radiation, some of the tissue becomes more calcified and more hardened. So anybody else that came for video fluoroscopy, we collected data. And it worked. Now we developed our algorithms based on this quite noisy data, under quotation, noisy data. And these algorithms seem to work fairly good. We never did pediatric studies yet. So during my postdoc, we did some pediatric studies, and we were able to capture similar data, but it's just more difficult with kids. Their necks are really tiny. So like, I remember even when we put the sensor on it, like it covered half of their neck, right? Even though like for humans, it's like centimeter by centimeter sensor, right? I know it works for pediatrics, for peds as well, but we did not go that route. But for adults, pretty much anybody except head and neck works no problem. We are able to detect it. And what I found out that is more important to have somewhat a protocol that is unified across patient groups, rather than, I did not find that various patient groups affect our results too much more than the protocol, in a sense that, if you're going to have a patient's swallowing thin liquids, then it should be thin liquids across different groups, right? Instead of, we cannot just give liquids to one group and then give, steak to another and hope that it's going to be all the same. Like there has to be some level of consistency across different, but it's not that we're not that sensitive to differences in patient groups.
Okay, but does that mean that you've also had healthy people in order to distinguish between a normal healthy swallow and a pathological swallow?
Yes, we did. So we also collected data, if I remember correctly, from 170 healthy controls. So we are able to differentiate between healthy controls and patients that have dysphagia.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that even within the population of neurology patients, for example, there may be a big variability, and also in an individual, different swallows may turn out very different. So how to make that a bit less abstract, maybe let's look at older people. How does this method differentiate between a healthy swallow and then a healthy but older swallow?
In our healthy controls group, we collected data. I think we looked at across different entire age spans, so from 18 to 65, 70. The changes according to aging, we did not specifically narrow to that question. We were more looking as, it does not matter what your age is, does your swallow present a sign of dysphagia or not? Of course, we all know as we progress towards, 80, 85 years of age, we all get dysphagia. We all have these issues. We were able to capture signs of dysphagia, even in healthy controls. So I think there were 1 or 2 participants in our healthy controls where I think Jim referred them later on to say, like, you should really see a specialist. Age does not play a role to us yet. Again, all our data was collected concurrently with video fluoroscopy. So we were able to score each swallow based on penetration aspiration scale. There are many, many students that we have to thank them for their work, because somebody had to sit down, and in our database we have, I think, about 7,000 swallows right now, right? So
wow, that's a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of students, a lot of hours. Thank you. Maybe to conclude this episode, can you paint us a picture of what the clinical workflow could be? So if everything goes according to plan, what does dysphagia assessment look like in, let's say, 10 years?
I'm hoping that dysphagia assessment becomes one of those things that if a patient is rushed into emergency room, that dysphagia assessment becomes one of the, few things that is done right away, especially for like stroke patients or some of those. Right, because right now, what do we measure when, patient comes in? We assess, typically temperature, body temperature, blood pressure, and we stop there. I'm hoping that maybe dysphagia, and not just for emergency room settings, but that dysphagia assessment becomes one of those things that we typically check on each doctor's visit. I have a feeling that we are underdiagnosing dysphagia problems in general population, and that many people suffer from dysphagia or some aspects of dysphagia even without realizing. And I'm hoping that we can move that kind of swallowing assessment becomes one of the major 3 assessments that we assess for every patient that comes in, right? Because I honestly believe we need to pay more attention to, again, to me, like coming out of engineering into SLP field, like my mind was exploding when I realized that, how severe these issues are and how little we know about them and how little attention we pay to them. I'm hoping now that we're all generally more aware about nutrition and the role of nutrition in everyday health. I'm hoping that, we will finally start paying attention even to swallowing and, swallowing impairments.
Definitely, for sure.
So I'm hoping that we will, by developing these solutions and devices and things that can be used in every day, that we can actually move from kind of occasional assessment just because you had stroke, we're going to assess your swallowing. And even then we're going to do a, bad job because we're going to just give you a glass of water and hopefully you'll cough, right? The fact that you silently aspirate, well, too bad, right? We're going to give you more food. So I'm hoping that down the road we can actually move this into the mainstream and become one of those vital signs of life.
Yeah, for sure. And these kinds of devices may make it more accessible as well in areas where there is not a swallowing specialist available all the time. So yeah, thank you, Ervin, so much for taking the time to share your experience and your knowledge with us and our listeners.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys for reaching out. And if you need anything else, just let me know.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can connect with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky, or visit our website, dysphagiamatters.org. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care.